1914 saw Estonian Lionel Martin build a car to compete in the Aston Clinton hill climb, giving the Aston Martin company its name. He was a motorsport enthusiast and business partner for the Bamford and Aston garage in London. He used the hill climb events as an advertising campaign for his race car model and soon received orders for replicas, and by 1924 he'd built 50 cars. Aston Martin continued racing after World War One. However, racing ended up costing Lionel Martin over £100,000, which equates to over $5 million in today's money. And in 1926, he sold Aston Martin. Its new owner was Augustus Caesar Bertelli, an Italian who had moved to Cardiff in 1894, who had briefly worked at Fiat after World War One. In 1932, Aston Martin releases the Le Mans sports car. It was available as either a 2 or 4-seater. It had a very highly developed 1.5 litre straight 4 which produced 70 horsepower. The model was expensive and exclusive, and they only sold 130 cars in its 2 years on sale. During the late 1930s, Bertelli's relationship with the Sutherland Group hits turbulence, and in 1937, Bertelli leaves the motor trade altogether to become a farmer and a successful pig breeder. His role at Aston Martin is succeeded by Claude Hill. However, during the war, there's no time to release new models, as Aston Martin's main duty was the production of aircraft parts. In 1940, Aston Martin releases the Atom concept car. It's one of the world's first concept cars. It's a 4-door saloon that's engine and chassis was used until the late 1950s. In 1947, Sir David Brown of David Brown Tractors buys Aston Martin, and the following year it buys another car company, Lagonda. 1948 sees the release of the Aston Martin DB1. DB was referencing David Brown's initials. Initially, the car was developed by Claude Hill. It featured a 2-litre 4-cylinder that developed 90 horsepower. Only 15 were ever built. In 1950, Aston Martin releases the DB2. It features a 2.6-litre straight-six Lagonda engine, which is good for 110 miles an hour. In the 1950s Le Mans, it came first and second in the 3-litre class. In the late 1950s, Aston Martin released the DB Mark III, an evolution of the DB2. Its 6-cylinder engine displacement had been increased to 2.9 litres, and in top spec it had 195 horsepower. It was also available as a 4-seat hatchback. 550 Mark IIIs were built in 3 years, 5 of which were automatic. In 1958, Aston Martin revealed the DB4. It caused a stir at the London Motor Show. It featured a body that was designed by Carrozzeria Touring of Milan in Italy. It featured a much larger 3.7 litre straight 6 that produced 240 horsepower and was good for 140 miles an hour. In 1961, Aston Martin releases the Lagonda Rapide, a large luxury saloon that was over 5 metres long. It was David Brown's attempt to revive the Lagonda brand. Only 55 of these were built. In 1963, Aston Martin released the DB5. It featured the same 282 horsepower 4-litre straight 6 as the Lagonda Rapide. In 1964, an uprated version with 325 horsepower called the DB5 Vantage was released. The DB5 gained great fame being the James Bond Aston. It originally starred in Goldfinger and has reappeared in many other Bond films. A handful of DB5 coupes were rebodied for David Brown as shooting brakes, as he struggled to carry around his dogs and polo equipment in his regular DB5. The Aston Martin DB6 followed the DB5. It featured similar engines but improved aerodynamics. In 1967, Aston Martin released the DBS. It was initially available with the same engines as the DB5 and DB6, but in 1969 it came available with a 5.3-litre V8. In 1970, the DBS V8 was the world's fastest 4-seat production car. In 1972, David Brown has to sell Aston Martin, Lagonda and David Brown Tractors to pay off his debts. In 1972, he sells to William Wilson, but there's a worldwide recession and the company is unable to develop an engine that can meet the California's emission regulations. In 1974, Aston Martin goes bankrupt, its factory is closed and 460 staff members are laid off. However, Aston Martin found a new owner and the factories are soon reopened. 1976 saw the release of the Aston Martin Lagonda. It was a hand-built 5.3 metre long luxury saloon that cost as much as a Rolls-Royce of the time. It featured a striking wedge-shaped design, was powered by a 5.3-litre V8, and it was the first car in the world to have a digital dashboard. The development cost of the Lagonda's electronics cost 4 times the budget of what the whole car was meant to have cost. 1977 saw the release of the V8 Vantage, commonly known as Britain's first supercar. It had a V8 engine which came in 5.3 or 6.3 litre forms. It produced up to 450 horsepower, was good for 170 miles an hour and could hit 60 in little over 5 seconds, while the late 80s Zagato version could hit nearly 190. In 1987, Ford buys out Aston Martin, and 2 years later it also buys out Jaguar, thus creating Ford's premier automotive group. 1989 sees the release of the Aston Martin Virage. It's a replacement for the aging V8 Vantage. It was to be Aston Martin's flagship model, with uprated V8 engines from the previous Vantage models. The top performance model was the Virage Vantage, which was powered by a twin supercharger at 5.3 litre V8, which produced 550 horsepower, had 186 mph top speed, and could hit 60 in 4.5 seconds. In 1999, before production ended, a run-out Le Mans edition was available. Only 40 were built, but it had 604 horsepower, a top speed of 200, and it could hit 60 in under 4 seconds. 1994 saw the release of the Aston Martin DB7, an Ian Callum design. It shared a Jaguar XJS chassis and had a Ford supercharged V6. In 1999, this engine was replaced by a new 5.9 litre V12. It had up to 435 horsepower and it could hit 60 in under 5 seconds. 7,000 DB7s were sold, the highest production number of any Aston Martin to date. 2001 saw the release of the Aston Martin Vanquish. It sat above the DB7. It was another Ian Callum design, and its V12 produced up to 520 horsepower and it could hit up to 200 miles an hour. 2004 saw the release of the Aston Martin DB9. They skipped the DB8 number in case potential buyers thought that it had a V8 engine. It shared the same V12 engine as the Vanquish. It was one of the most desirable designs of its time and was described as too cool for the cool wall by BBC's Top Gear. 2006 saw the release of the new Aston Martin Vantage. It had a V8 that was loosely related to Jaguar's V8. Initially a 4.3 litre, but from 2008 the engine was upgraded to 4.7 litres and produced 420 horsepower. It also had a V12 option. The top of the range was the Vantage V12S, which had 565 horsepower, could hit 60 in under 4 seconds, and had a 205 mph top speed. Aston Martin built over 25,000 Vantages over a 12-year period, its most produced model ever. 2009 saw the release of the 177, of which 77 were built, each costing £1.2 million. Power came from a 7.3 litre V12 Cosworth engine, which produced 750 horsepower. Independent tests showed that it could do over 220 miles an hour. It was the most powerful, naturally aspirated production engine at the time. 2010 saw the release of the Rapide. It was essentially a four-door DB9. At the top of the range sat the Rapide S. It was one of the world's fastest saloon cars, at a 205 mph top speed and could do 60 in 4 seconds. There was even an electric prototype that was built. 2011 saw the release of the controversial Signet. It was based on the Toyota IQ and used a Toyota 1.3 litre engine. It was built to help Aston Martin meet EU CO2 targets. Less than 600 were built. One of them was fitted with a 4.7 litre engine. It cost nearly £30,000 when new. However, even today, they cost between £25,000 and £50,000 as they're such a sought-after model. 2015 saw the release of the Aston Martin Vulcan, a track-only sports car that produced 820 horsepower from a 7 litre naturally aspirated V12. It could hit 60 in 2.9 seconds and had a 208 mph top speed. At 190 miles an hour, it produced more kilograms of downforce than what it weighed in total. Each model cost £1.8 million. Some buyers chose to spend an extra £300,000 to convert them for road use. 2016 saw the release of the Aston Martin DB11. These were the first Aston Martins to use AMG engines. They had the option of a 4 litre twin-turbo V8 or 5.2 litre twin-turbo V12. The top model had 600 horsepower and could hit over 200 miles an hour. 2018 saw the release of the Aston Martin DBS. It was based on the DB11 and used the 5.2 litre twin-turbo V12 with up to 760 horsepower. It had a 211 mph top speed, making it one of the fastest series production Aston Martins ever built. 2018 saw the release of the new Aston Martin Vantage. It was smaller than the DB11, however it used the same engines. It's the last Vantage to use a V12. 2019 saw Aston Martin collaborate with Red Bull Racing to produce the Valkyrie. The car featured a naturally aspirated 6.5 litre V12, which was developed by Cosworth and would rev to 10,500 RPM. It was assisted by a hybrid setup, with a total output of 1,160 horsepower, in a car that weighed only 1,030 kilograms. This beat the original plan of 1,000 horsepower per tonne. The car could hit 60 in 2.6 seconds, with a Pro version which would be good for over 250 miles an hour. 2020 saw the release of the controversial DBX. It's the first ever Aston Martin SUV. At the top of the range sat the 700 horsepower DBX 707. It's the world's fastest SUV, can hit 60 in 3.1 seconds as has a top speed of 193 miles an hour. 2024 sees the release of the Aston Martin DB12. Unlike its 12-cylinder predecessors, this model only comes available with twin-turbo V8s. The top of the range has 670 horsepower, can do 0 to 60 in 3.6 seconds, and has a 202 mph top speed.